Today's episode: The Heartless Pharaoh, How the Ruler Was Prepared for Eternity. Unequal marriage: Why the Pharaoh's widow sought a husband among Egypt's enemies. Changing tombs with a top-up: Why Tutankhamun was placed in someone else's tomb. Running to Anubis: What injury sent Tutankhamun into the jaws of the Egyptian god of death. You'll also discover how an ancient priestess sank the Titanic, whether the creator of Sherlock Holmes could foresee the future, and who makes it onto the blacklist of potential victims, and why. British archaeologists have made a sensational statement. In their opinion, the world-famous golden mask of Tutankhamun belongs not to the young pharaoh, but to a woman. Pierced ears support this hypothesis. No male death mask depicts such a detail. Another piece of evidence is the hieroglyphics. Tutankhamun's name is inscribed over another inscription. All this suggests that the pharaoh was buried in a hurry. But why? Egypt, the Valley of the Kings. November 11, 1925. English professor Douglas Derry and Egyptian anatomist Salih B. Hamdi began a complex operation. They had to remove the wrappings in which the mummy of Pharaoh Tutankhamun was enclosed. It is the only intact royal mummy in the world. For the first time, science had a chance to uncover the most revealing secrets of the ancients. But it soon became clear that there would be no sensation. The mummy had simply been re-embalmed with resins, which are always used in the process of mummification. However, there was an excessive amount of these resins. So much, in fact, that they had even burned the threads and soft tissues of the mummy. It had lain undisturbed for 3,300 years. So why had it been so poorly preserved? Surprisingly, the royal mummies whose tombs were plundered shortly after their burial were in better condition. Their bandages had not been as deeply soaked with oils and resins as those of Tutankhamun's mummy. Due to these resins, the pharaoh's body had adhered to his golden sarcophagus, and archaeologists had to chip it away. Of course, the mummy was damaged in the process. Today, such archaeology would be considered barbaric. But victors are not judged. Howard Carter, who discovered the pharaoh's tomb in 1922, felt like a hero. He ordered the pharaoh's body to be extracted from the sarcophagus with a pickaxe. To remove all the pharaoh's jewelry, his arms were cut at the shoulders, elbows, and wrists. Later, these were all glued back together with resin, making the already heavily damaged mummy even more fragile. There were breaches of protocol during the removal of Tutankhamun's mummy from the tomb by Carter and his team. Part of the sternum was simply torn off along with the mask. The initial examination revealed that the pharaoh was 18 years old. Between the 17 layers of thin linen bandages, there were almost 150 objects, including jewelry and weapons. There were golden finger guards on his hands and feet. The heart was missing. In his report, Carter did not mention that he had essentially dismembered the mummy. This was only discovered in 1968. American biologist and professor of anatomy Ross Harrison used an X-ray machine for the re-examination of Tutankhamun's mummy. This is what the X-ray from 1968 revealed. The condition of the mummy had significantly deteriorated. 2 layers of resin were found around the head. The beaded cap had disappeared from the head, and a part of the skin was missing. Small decorative elements were scattered across the body. Harrison was particularly intrigued by the pharaoh's fractured skull. This led to the assumption that Tutankhamun's death was violent. There was a theory that the pharaoh had been killed by a blow to the head, that he had fallen from his chariot, being an avid chariot rider, and had been fatally injured. In any case, sepsis had set in, and he eventually died. This theory partly explains why the king's burial was conducted in such a rush. No one was prepared for Tutankhamun's sudden death. Many details were simply out of place. Some were hastily arranged, and there was wood shavings and other materials left behind in the burial chamber. The large outer coffin had been damaged by a heavy blow from a hammer. Why was there such a lack of care in one of the most important state ceremonies? The burial of a pharaoh? It seemed that everyone was in a terrible hurry. There was no time to properly treat the body, decorate the tomb walls, or gather the items that the ruler would need in the afterlife. Who was rushing the artisans and priests? A serious problem arose because Tutankhamun's lineage, the entire 18th dynasty, was at risk of being interrupted. Tutankhamun had no direct heirs. There were two claimants to the throne, his widow Ancestry and the high official Ai. The widow could have retained power if she remarried before Tutankhamun's burial. She had to hurry because Ai was acting like the rightful successor, leading Tutankhamun on his final journey. To achieve his goal, he was prepared to break all the centuries-old traditions. He decided what to depict on the tomb's walls. This could perhaps be called the first state commission in the world. The paintings cannot be compared to those in the tombs of great kings such as Seti I or Ramses. Only the burial chamber was decorated, and sadly, it is all very modest. These are the images. One of the most prominent figures is A himself. He is performing a ceremony that only the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt can conduct. Essentially, he is proclaiming himself the new pharaoh. The painting is of very low quality. Unpleasant brown stains are visible on the walls. The artists were in such a rush that they did not even wait for the walls to dry properly. What surprises contemporaries is how this chamber fails to meet the usual requirements for a royal tomb. There are only 4 rooms: an antechamber, the burial chamber, a treasury, and a storeroom. If we look at the tombs of Tutankhamun's predecessors in the 18th dynasty, such as Thutmose III, we see dozens of rooms, whereas here there are only 4. There were large, wide corridors between these chambers, which are absent here. This was a very modest tomb. Who was it intended for? After all, not just anyone could be buried in the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun's tomb did not originally belong to him, but was most likely prepared by A for himself. Let's compare the sizes of the pharaoh's tombs from the 18th dynasty with Tutankhamun's tomb. From the outside, it looks like a thick phone book next to a matchbox. Traditionally, the tomb was filled with items that the pharaoh might need in the afterlife. More than 5,000 objects were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The antechamber contained chariots, thrones, and statues of guards. The burial chamber held coffins and sarcophagi with the mummy. The treasury was filled with jewelry, precious stones, lamps, vases, and a statue of Anubis, the god of funerary rites. And the storeroom held food supplies, wine, and clothing. It took 7 weeks to unpack all the items in just the antechamber. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb do not all belong to him. There are items belonging to Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV, and Queen Tiye. Only 1/5 of all the objects in the tomb are related to Tutankhamun. The rest were brought from elsewhere. Even the sarcophagus may have originally been intended for someone else. The sarcophagus was like a set of Russian nesting dolls. There were several sarcophagi inside one another. The innermost one, made entirely of gold, is particularly well known. These sarcophagi were further enclosed in special boxes. These box-shaped coffins are essentially a model of the universe. The outer box represented the horizon. The second and third boxes represented the palaces of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the innermost box was the pharaoh's palace. It took the archaeologists 3 months to dismantle and remove these boxes from the burial chamber. Imagine, the burial chamber is 25 square meters, and it contains a 5-meter-long and 3.5-meter wide coffin. Was it easy for the coffin builders to work in these conditions? The coffin could not be brought into the tomb in its entirety. It was first assembled from individual parts, and the artisans marked the pieces. The coffin was then put together inside the tomb, like a construction kit. I, who was claiming the throne, filled the treasury with all the necessary items. It seemed that power was within his grasp, but Tutankhamun's widow was not going to give up easily. She took a strange and, at first glance, ill-considered step. She asked the Hittite king to send a prince. She wrote, "I do not want to marry one of my subjects, and I will make the Hittite prince king. The Hittite king was so shocked by this proposal because Egypt was a colossal superpower at the time. He even initially refused to believe it. By making this proposal, Tutankhamun's widow was trying to reconcile Egypt and the Hittites. Perhaps Tutankhamun had the same goal. A DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy in 2011 showed that the Hittites were among his recent ancestors. Tutankhamun and the Hittite ruler may have known about this, but it remains a mystery. In any case, the Hittite prince set off for Egypt but was killed on the way. This provided a strong reason for war. In the face of an external threat, Tutankhamun's widow and I decided to become allies and married. An epidemic of plague broke out in Egypt. Sick people began to appear in the Hittite army, and it retreated. This would later lead to wars between Ramses II and the Hittites, so this conflict would echo through Egyptian history. Tutankhamun's widow and her new husband then disappear without a trace from Egyptian history. Neither their mummies nor their tombs have been found. Perhaps this is retribution for the crude violation of the pharaoh's burial traditions. These frames were captured at the very beginning of 1923 when the expedition of Egyptologist Howard Carter discovered the first ever unlooted tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Later, Carter said, "Of all Tutankhamun's life, we know only one fact, namely, he died and was buried." How did the ordinary British archaeologist Howard Carter manage to make the discovery of the century? It all started with his acquaintance with the collector of Egyptian antiquities and traveler, Lord Carnarvon. For several seasons, they excavated in the Valley of the Kings in an area that was considered unpromising. It was filled with construction debris. To remove several thousand tons of sand and gravel, a narrow-gauge railway had to be built. Carnarvon wanted to move the excavation site, but Carter did not lose faith in his destiny to find an unlooted tomb. In 1922, he succeeded. His intuition, of course, played a crucial role, as Carter had an incredible hunch. Additionally, Carnarvon's support and subsidies for Carter's endeavors formed a strong partnership. Thus, they discovered the tomb together. Why did other archaeologists ignore this particular area? Perhaps it was because Carter simply followed his intuition. The entrance to this tomb is different. Remains of huts belonging to the workers who built the tomb of Ramses were found there. Therefore, no one even searched for it. Carter ordered the demolition of one of the shacks. There, a stone step was discovered. There is a legend that an Arab boy who was brewing tea for the workers was the first to notice this step. It is said that Carter rewarded the lucky boy. A beautiful photograph was taken of the boy wearing one of Tutankhamun's magnificent necklaces, as instructed by Carter. The boy later earned money by standing near the tomb with this photograph. Carter found untouched royal seals at the entrance to the tomb. There is no doubt that this is indeed the tomb of one of the rulers of ancient Egypt. His rest had not been disturbed by looters. To prove this, one must enter the most sacred place, the burial chamber. But first, the front rooms must be cleared of numerous invaluable artifacts. No one on the expedition expected there to be so many. At the end of November, the famous event, already described many times in popular science literature, took place when the doors were opened, and Carter, upon inserting a kerosene lamp into the opening, looked inside. Carnarvon asked, "What do you see?" "Wonderful things," Howard Carter replied. "It took 10 years to inventory and process all the materials from the tomb." The archaeologists had to work under very challenging conditions. Politics interfered with the scholars' research. Egypt gained its independence. A surge in national consciousness occurred. Egyptians began to feel that they were the heirs of the world of Egyptian kings. The tomb's discovery took place at this time. Essentially, they gained a sense of self-awareness in this tomb, understanding who they truly were. The interests of British archaeologists, backed by the British Crown, clashed with those of the Egyptians, who wanted all the discovered treasures to remain in Egypt. Was it too late to realize this? There are strong suspicions that some items from Tutankhamun's tomb were secretly sent to the West. Apparently, Lord Carnarvon took some artifacts, not very significant ones, out of Egypt. Egypt demanded their return. In 2022, Professor of Egyptology Mark Gabould suggested that Carter or members of his team had taken artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb out of Egypt. Beads from the wide collar worn by the pharaoh can be seen in different museums. The Art Museum of St. Louis houses an ornament based on Egyptian beads. In 2015, a necklace made from the same beads was put up for auction. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York owned a faience collar from Tutankhamun's tomb for many years. In 2011, the artifact was returned to Egypt. Some modern researchers justify Carter's actions. At that time, archaeological ethics were quite different. Moreover, there were many such small items in the tomb. It feels like they wanted to put an end to that era. They gathered all the items associated with Tutankhamun's predecessors and sealed them in one tomb. A dispute arose between the Egyptian authorities and the expedition participants regarding the portion of the discovered artifacts that should belong to Lord Carnarvon. It turned out that he was not entitled to any. According to the contract between Lord Carnarvon and the Antiquities Service, 50% was supposed to be given to the archaeologists who excavated the site. Carnarvon and his wife, Almina Boyle, who subsidized the excavations, had invested £75,000. According to today's exchange rate, it amounts to approximately £4 million sterling. For that time, it was a vast sum of money that the Lord and his wife did not want to lose. This was actually the first such precedent in history when a unique tomb was discovered. Usually, archaeologists could receive half of the artifacts by contract, but in this case, there was no half to be shared. Everything remained with Egypt. This was not the only bad news for the archaeologists. In 1923, Lord Carnarvon died. After that, rumors about the curse of the pharaohs began to spread. Carnarvon died soon after he and Carter entered the pharaoh's burial chamber. He is the most famous victim. Others followed. There are 22 people on the list of those who, it is claimed, fell victim to the pharaoh's curse. Some met their end in accidents, while others succumbed to incurable diseases. All those who came into contact with mummies had an unfortunate fate. However, in each individual case, it turns out that their deaths were not caused by Tutankhamun's supposed curse. Skeptics argue that most of Carter's expedition members reached an advanced age. But what about the tablet found in the tomb? The text on the tablet is translated differently in various versions, but the general meaning is clear. Death will claim those who disturb the pharaoh's peace. Many inscriptions related to Tutankhamun's funerary cult have been found. However, the inscription sometimes quoted does not exist. It was made up. Whether a fabrication or not, newspapers began to spread this story. Archaeologists themselves were partly to blame for this. When the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon signed an exclusive agreement with a single periodical, the Times. As a result, all other periodicals, including Egyptian ones, had to obtain information from the Times. This inequality angered journalists. Without receiving reliable information from the excavation site, they began to publish various myths and fantasies. The myth proved to be resilient. Now, the curse of the pharaohs is not only associated with Tutankhamun specifically, but with Egyptian tombs in general. Arthur Conan Doyle, the master of adventure literature, picked up on the curse theme. Towards the end of his life, the writer became fascinated with mysticism and even conducted spiritualist seances. But why was he convinced that Lord Carnarvon's death was caused by the influence of invisible spirits guarding the king's tomb? Conan Doyle visited Egypt only once, in 1895, with his wife. The impressions from that trip lasted a lifetime. Many travelers experienced a sense of horror when they entered these tombs. They saw the mysterious images of gods with animal heads. What were these creatures, and what did they believe in? What kind of amazing mysticism was this? In Conan Doyle's stories and novels, an inexplicable panic seems to emanate from Egyptian artifacts. The legend of the avenging mummy largely originated from the writer's talent. In the 20th century, horror films made this myth one of the most popular in popular culture. In America, even earlier, comics appeared in which criminals kidnapped female mummies to unwind their bandages and take their jewels. It all ended with the death of the villains or a global catastrophe. People are wary not only of the mummies of the kings, but of Egyptian mummies in general. Some approach them with reverence, while others with fear. However, this is again due to people's lack of knowledge about what Egyptian mummies truly represent. As is known, ignorance and fear feed off each other. As early as the 3rd millennium BCE, the Egyptians learned how to mummify the dead. The body was soaked in a solution of salts, resins, and incense, then tightly wrapped in linen bandages. They mummified not only humans, but also their beloved pets. The elder brother of Akhenaten had a beloved cat that was honored with a burial fit for a noble. It had a special stone sarcophagus. It is now kept in the Cairo Museum. Europeans learned about the art of ancient embalmers thanks to Napoleon's Egyptian expedition. A fashion for all things Egyptian immediately followed. Napoleon, imitating Alexander the Great, ordered that many scholars of various specialties be included in the Egyptian expedition. Thanks to their efforts, a multi-volume work called Description of Egypt was later created. The entire enlightened world learned about the existence of Egyptian civilization directly from their contemporaries. How did Europeans perceive the civilization that was revealed to them? A barbaric plunder of Egyptian treasures began. Mummies were the unluckiest. Mummies began to be mass exported to Europe. They were turned into powder, which was used as an elixir of immortality or as fertilizer. This story is very similar to the blind belief in the miraculous properties of, say, rhino horn powder. It's pretty much the same thing. Mummies were not only used to make medicine, but also paints, which were highly valued by artists. People believed that Egyptian manuscripts contained spells and chemical formulas for potions capable of awakening a mummy from its slumber. Wealthy collectors sometimes bought mummies to entertain their guests by publicly unwinding the mummies and freeing them from their burial shrouds. Demonstrative unwinding of mummies was even arranged in museums and theaters. Not only scandalous reporters, but also renowned scientists attended these performances. This attitude towards the dead was combined with a mass fear of the pharaoh's retribution. When the Titanic sank in 1912, a rumor immediately emerged that the ship's demise was caused by the mummy of an Egyptian priestess kept in the British Museum. People started sending money so that the museum's management could buy flowers, place them at the mummy's feet, and thus appease it. The legend of the pharaoh's curse did not arise out of thin air. Those who believe in supernatural forces do not consider the facts. Most of the people directly involved in the looting of Tutankhamun's tomb, starting with Carter himself, who lived for another 17 years after the discovery, lived for many more years. This is the myth that continues to live on to this day. Indeed, why did the curse of the pharaohs not affect Howard Carter? After all, he was the first to look into Tutankhamun's tomb. But what if the curse lay dormant for decades and then struck a fatal blow? Scientists continue to debate the purpose of the over 130 canes placed in the pharaoh's tomb, including those he carved himself. Tutankhamun was disabled and not fully capable as a child. In 2023, the widely accepted theory of the young pharaoh's disability was challenged by biomolecular Egyptologist Safia Aziz, who studied Tutankhamun's computer tomography. The biomolecular expert is certain that there are no signs proving the pharaoh's clubfoot. The foot deformation mentioned by most researchers is a result of the mummy being too tightly wrapped. Additionally, the British archaeologists who conducted the initial examination handled the body extremely carelessly. The canes likely served not only as a support, but also had a magical purpose. When Tutankhamun held one particular cane, the skillfully carved figures of an Asian and an African at its top were upside down. Another cane depicts a bound Nubian, symbolizing the symbolic defeat of Egypt's enemies. The canes represent royal power, and the more there are, the stronger the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. Rulers and wise men of later times also collected canes. Peter I's collection numbered 400, and the French philosopher Voltaire had over 120. Archaeologists debated the purpose of the golden thimbles for the hands and feet of Tutankhamun. One theory suggested that servants kissed the tips of the golden fingers. According to another version, the thimbles were necessary for meeting the gods in the afterlife, just like the golden sandals. There was even a special ceremonial position at the court. The sandal bearer, a servant who looked after the footwear, stored it and presented it to the pharaoh. When Tutankhamun was buried, they tried to place significant items related to his life in the tomb. For example, there is a small toy depicting Amenhotep III and a lock of hair from the queen's grandmother, Taye. Researchers working with artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb continue to surprise the world with sensational discoveries. A dagger hidden under the bandages turned out to be made of metal of extraterrestrial origin, with a chemical composition similar to that of iron meteorites. The most surprising thing is that at that time, there were no masters in Egypt capable of forging iron, which was valued higher than gold. This explains why there are iron items in the treasure chamber. But why were they placed on the mummy? Meteorite iron has disinfecting properties, and there is a hypothesis that the priests used this method to disinfect. It is quite possible that Tutankhamun died of an infection. After all, life expectancy in Egypt was not very high, and even pharaohs were not immune to contracting incurable diseases or falling victim to epidemics. This theory is quite plausible when one considers how thoroughly the coffins and sarcophagi were sealed. The 4 coffins are assembled from 80 massive parts, and the sarcophagus itself is equally impressive, with one of its lids weighing almost 1.5 tons. It is as if the priests were trying to isolate something very securely. Based on descriptions, it is very likely that many pharaohs died of infectious diseases during those years. This was also a leading cause of death before the antibiotic era, in principle, for humanity. In 2024, paleontologists discovered traces of bubonic plague in an ancient Egyptian mummy, which is 3,290 years old. An epidemic, presumably the plague, seems to be spreading in the Middle East, at least in the eastern Mediterranean, in Egyptian territories, and in Egypt itself, which could have affected the royal court and caused the death of Tutankhamun. The epidemic may end naturally when all susceptible people become infected and recover. To stop the epidemic, Egyptian priests isolated the dead from the living. Perhaps this burial method was specifically invented to prevent the transmission of the infectious disease to others and minimize risks for themselves. Could a virus have remained in the sarcophagus for millennia, only to break free and become a serial killer, eliminating one by one the witnesses who saw the tomb opened? But this hypothesis did not receive support from scientists. It is known that viruses can only be stored for so long in a frozen state, in ice. The dry Egyptian climate kills them. Fungi are a different matter. Some fungal spores can be stored almost indefinitely. There is evidence of fungal spores being found, including in Tutankhamun's tomb. Egyptian tombs are an ideal environment for fungal growth, which can cause serious infections, allergic reactions, and provoke liver cancer. While Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed, the fungus was in a state of rest, as if accumulating strength to cause the disease at the right moment. Perhaps the death of Lord Carnarvon and other expedition members was caused by the same illness that killed Tutankhamun. Why was the young pharaoh's body unable to cope with the disease? We must consider his very poor genetics and initially poor health. Yes, his medical history, to put it in medical terms, was very poor, as it was a direct consequence of the practice of consanguineous marriages during the 18th dynasty. This is a reconstruction of Tutankhamun's body, showing signs of degeneration, small facial features, crooked teeth, and feminine hips. When we see a close familial connection, it is always a red flag for a geneticist. Many of these pharaohs were unable to leave descendants. We see some female characteristics in a man that should not be there under normal circumstances. Scientists suggest that Tutankhamun suffered from several serious illnesses at once, a direct consequence of consanguineous marriage. His parents were a brother and sister, the children of Amenhotep III. In such a marriage, the highest risk of giving birth to a sick child is 25%. Why didn't the pharaohs become extinct with so many consanguineous marriages? They still had a chance of having healthy offspring. According to some data, Ramses II had 111 sons and 67 daughters. The rulers of ancient Egypt had a firmly established order of succession, and to prevent the throne from passing to other claimants, sisters married brothers or other close relatives. Geneticists say there is no way to trace how this affected the next generation. A precise diagnosis cannot be made for the pharaoh, and this is merely a supposition. There are some limitations to analyzing ancient DNA, and interpreting it unequivocally today is also problematic from the perspective of clinical genetics. It is not preserved in an ideal state, and there is a high probability of obtaining a false result when analyzing such DNA. It can be determined with great certainty whether the death was natural or violent. Scientists have found that Tutankhamun's mother was probably murdered, as a deep wound was discovered on her face. Tutankhamun's father, Pharaoh Akhenaten, was poisoned. Akhenaten is known for introducing the world's first religious reform, deciding to establish monotheism in ancient Egypt. He built a new capital, Akhetaten, proclaimed the cult of the sun god Aten, and called himself his deputy. Tutankhamun ascended the throne at the age of 9. The young pharaoh called himself the heir of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, his grandfather. It would seem that Akhenaten's reforms were completely reversed, but it is not so simple. During Tutankhamun's reign, the court moved from Akhenaten's capital, the city of Akhetaten, to Memphis. This is very important, as it was not to Thebes, which would have meant a complete reversal of Akhenaten's reforms, as Thebes was the capital. Tutankhamun's return to Memphis, the ancient capital, can be understood as a symbol of a return to one's roots. This is a quite reasonable decision for a mature politician. Was Tutankhamun as dependent as he is portrayed? Did he try to avoid his father's fate and compromise with the hostile priestly class? We will never know, but it is certain that the religious counter-reformation did not help the pharaoh. Akhenaten was soon excluded from the official royal lists and therefore from history, and Tutankhamun shared much of his predecessor's, his father's, fate. The ancient Egyptian historian Manetho, who lived at the end of the 4th century BCE, wrote a history of Egypt in ancient Greek. Tutankhamun's name is not mentioned in it. Does he deserve to be forgotten? The opening of Tutankhamun's tomb became the main sensation of the 1920s. The whole world, without exaggeration, was watching the archaeologists' work in the Valley of the Kings. Gradually, questions started to accumulate. What was this young pharaoh like, and why did he die so early before reaching the age of 20? Various theories were put forward. There are quite a few of these theories. None of them, to be honest, are 100% confirmed. There are at least 5 versions of the young pharaoh's death. Medical professionals suggest that an infection, which was impossible to fight, killed him. Another probable cause is a genetic malfunction caused by close kin marriages. A fantastic hypothesis about Tutankhamun's death was proposed by the German historian William Heitsch. In the Cairo Museum, he saw a bird figurine that resembled a glider model. A copy of the museum exhibit was tested in a wind tunnel and proved to be capable of staying airborne. Specialists suggest that the ancient Egyptians, with their advanced technical thinking, could have had simple gliders. According to the scientist, some of the injuries found on Tutankhamun's mummy were sustained in a fall from a height. The world would not have known Tutankhamun if it weren't for Howard Carter. Even some of the Egyptologists working alongside Carter doubted that he was a real ruler. Howard decided to prove the opposite. Carter searched long and purposefully for Tutankhamun's tomb. As an experienced archaeologist, Carter knew what he was looking for and where. The question is, it took many years to do so. 6 seasons of excavations yielded no results. By that time, the Valley of the Kings had been dug up from end to end. As is often the case in Egyptian archaeology, Carnarvon, the sponsor of the excavations, said he would not provide any more money. Carter persuaded him to fund one last season. The final attempt brought the companions luck and worldwide fame. What worked? Professional intuition? Luck? Or was it just a well-prepared hoax? The king was buried in a great hurry. This, in turn, suggests that the pharaoh died suddenly. And this funerary equipment, intended to accompany the king to the afterlife, was also assembled in a rush. Who was really in a hurry? The priests and builders, or the archaeologist Carter and his assistants? Every year, more and more inconsistencies appear that the official history of the tomb's discovery fails to explain. In 2013, the American microbiologist Ralph Mitchell published the results of his research conducted in Tutankhamun's tomb. The black paint used for the wall paintings had smeared in many places, which ancient artists would never have allowed. Carter's assistants are suspected of spraying an extract of chaga fungus on the walls to create an aging effect. Without it, the frescoes would have been perceived as new, which they were, if one believes Carter's opponents. And what about the pharaoh's mummy? Let's recall the results of the X-ray. It showed 2 levels of resin around the head, meaning the mummy had been subjected to embalming twice. Why? To turn an ordinary mummy into a royal one. To make it more believable, decorations were placed under the bandages, and then the mummy was placed in a golden sarcophagus wearing a golden mask. The sarcophagus was filled with embalming resin and heated strongly. The hardened resin created the illusion of aging. There are also disputed aspects in the story of Tutankhamun's tomb regarding the age of the tomb and its contents. One can doubt that the mummy exhibited in the Cairo Museum is indeed the mummy of Tutankhamun, the son of Pharaoh Akhenaten. But how can one doubt that the death mask was intended for someone else? The Mask of Tutankhamun is the key exhibit of the treasures of Tutankhamun in the Cairo Museum. It is, and perhaps was, a unique work of ancient Egyptian art, especially since, in general, there are no analogues at such a high level of execution. The weight of the mask is over 10 kilograms, and its height is 54 centimeters. The masters who made it used heterogeneous materials. It was found that the mask is even made of gold of different carats, and gold of lower carats was used for the face compared to the rest of the mask. Researchers have found an explanation for why the mask was initially meant to belong to a queen, not a king. The image of the king is crowned not only by the cobra, uraeus, on the forehead, but this snake is combined with the head of a griffin. This element is characteristic of the iconography of queens, not kings. This in itself is already quite puzzling, as it would be strange to leave this element for a king. One would think that this artifact has been thoroughly studied and can no longer bring any new discoveries. However, in 2015, the British archaeologist Nicholas Reeves shocked the scientific world with his theory about who the death mask actually belonged to. The scientist's main argument is that Tutankhamun's name was inscribed over another inscription that read, "The living embodiment of the sun god, beloved of Akhenaten, the most beautiful of the solar disk." The golden mask, one of the most famous artifacts, originally belonged not to Tutankhamun, but possibly to a female ruler named Nefertiti, with whom Nefertiti is sometimes identified. Another blow to the reputation of the British archaeologist Howard Carter is the hypothesis that there was never any tomb of Tutankhamun. Here is an alternative version of the story. In 1917, the archaeologists discovered a modest burial. It may have belonged to one of the royal officials. The ambitious Carter came up with the idea of passing off the tomb as the burial place of a little-known pharaoh. The tomb was filled with various artifacts that Carter bought from illegal diggers. After waiting for the right moment, Carter announced the sensational discovery. It is no coincidence that only one newspaper, The Times, was given permission to publish photographs from the excavation site. Access was denied to other journalists who might have uncovered the truth. By the way, in 1922, Carter ordered the entrance to the tomb to be filled with debris, allegedly to prevent looters from entering. Perhaps he simply didn't want people to learn the truth about his manipulations. Not all is lost. The truth will eventually come to light. For some, it will be the truth of the documents. For others, the truth of the myth. As for Nefertiti, it would be good, I think, if she were not found, because it would be good for us to remember only her wonderful portraits and not see the mummy of Nefertiti. Not long ago, archaeologists excavated a pyramid of an unknown queen near Tutankhamun's tomb. What legend will this new discovery confirm or refute? Friends, what do you think about this? Write your thoughts in the comments. Well, if you liked the video, don't forget to support me with a like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.